The branches of government in the US are separated, of which the main one in the US is the legislative branch, not the executive at all. The president is subordinate to the legislative branch. This is enshrined in their constitution, in all the regulations and so on. That is, the president actually does not have the right to use military force, the US armed forces, outside the US without the permission of Congress. And Trump violated this, but so to speak, he explained it. They found legal loopholes there, all sorts of loopholes. By the way, the first and main loophole is that this is not a war and not the use of military forces, but a special military operation. In other words, he followed in Putin's footsteps, absolutely one-to-one. He said, you know, this is our CIA, and the CIA has a special status, and they, so to speak, can do things secretly. We weren't told anything, and for this, all that's needed is just, well, the president's authorization, a presidential decree. But the Senate was very dissatisfied with this. Moreover, by the way, the first to be dissatisfied were the Republicans, because there are a lot of Republicans who are unhappy with Trump and don't like him. And they want, so to speak, to get reelected and understand that Trump is preventing them from getting reelected this year when the new elections will take place. That's why this opposition could be quite serious. Trump, by the way, understands this. A few days ago, for the first time, he said something significant. They were celebrating the 250th anniversary of the American Congress. And Trump said that we need to mobilize, because if we lose the midterm elections, they'll impeach me and remove me from office ahead of time. This is exactly what we've discussed with you repeatedly over the past few months. I have repeatedly referred you to American domestic polling, including within the MAGA movement and the Republican Party. And for the first time, Trump himself publicly voiced this. And the Senate, in principle, really doesn't like it when its powers are encroached upon. Trump has repeatedly violated these rules. For example, when he tried to disband Radio Liberty, the Senate also overturned all those actions. In his detailed explanation, he pointed out that these specific radio stations and these various media organizations are actually fully funded and supported by the United States Congress through official government appropriations. Therefore, only Congress can disband them, so Congress can disband them. If Congress has voted, then the president does not have the right to overturn by executive order what Congress has decided. Congress is stronger than the president of the United States. So we've given our viewers a little legal insight, and now let's move on to the story itself. By the way, the story continued because you already know that 2 ships were also seized. The US, in particular, one ship that changed its flag to Russian. That was, so to speak, the continuation of the party. Well, you were right to say that in France, opinions are divided. Our main leftist, like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, he was a big supporter of Chavez. He used to hug him all the time, all day long, and with Maduro too. So, of course, when Maduro was ousted, our leftists here also raised a fuss. Terrible that all of this is illegal, that in reality, of course, it is illegal. But the problem is that there is a difference between legality and legitimacy. And the problem is that the world history has shown us many times, when there is a regime that cannot be overthrown legally, then a revolution happens, which from the point of view of that regime is absolutely illegal. This is a violation of the law. This is, as it's called, an outrage. But if the revolution emerges victorious, then it becomes the new, rightful, and recognized governing authority. And then it legitimizes the fundamental fact that it ascended to its position of power by force. That is actually how the ongoing correction of both international and domestic law functions and evolves over time.
Do you remember there's a poem? A rebellion cannot end in success, otherwise it's called something else. That's right.
Otherwise, it's simply called a change of regime. And then it's nothing anymore. Not a rebellion, but simply a revolution at that point. And a revolution, well, it sweeps everyone away. And so you see, there's the Tsar, you shoot him, and that's it. According to the Tsarist laws, this is the most serious crime, regicide, murder. But under the new laws, you get orders and medals for it. So it's all a matter of perspective. From a legal standpoint, you can justify it that way. Of course, that's written law. International law encourages the use of force. It encourages interference in the sovereign affairs of sovereign states and so on. So we all know this. We saw Putin dragging out the war against the sovereign state of Ukraine. By the way, this war was classified as such by the United Nations, by the General Assembly. This couldn't be done in the Security Council because Russia has a veto there. The question
is about how flawless and effective the so-called international law really is in practice.
It's not perfect. It only works when everything is fine. If everything is fine, then they gather at the UN and adopt some resolutions that mean nothing. Everyone eats caviar, drinks champagne, and so on. Everyone feels great, getting salaries that aren't taxed in their own countries, and so on. But if any problem arises, then the UN, by the way, the League of Nations before it was even worse. It proved that it couldn't actually regulate anything because only rarely sometimes it made attempts. So the main attempt, for example, a historically significant one in our time, is the Korean War, because the Korean War was under the mandate of the United Nations. So roughly speaking, against the Chinese and North Koreans, the coalition, primarily the Americans, acted under the mandate of the United Nations. You
Remember, right? Sergey Olehovich, why was this war even possible under such a pretext? Because Stalin quite unexpectedly ordered the representatives of the USSR not to participate in the vote. And during the decisive vote, they were simply absent because Joseph Vissarionovich decided at that time that the conflict on the Korean Peninsula would lead to a certain weakening of the United States, which would be in the interests of the USSR. And afterwards, no one was happy about it. Of course, Zhou Enlai, who came to Stalin's funeral in 1953 without waiting for the end of the funeral ceremony, went straight up to Malenkov on the mausoleum's tribune and said, well, at that time, Zhou Enlai regarded Malenkov as the new leader. Well, there were others there too, including Khrushchev. In short, right during the funeral, Zhou Enlai, he said, listen, we urgently need to do something about the Korean War. It needs to be ended. Nobody needs it. Everyone is tired of it. And negotiations started right away. And as a result, by the summer of 1953, the conflict essentially reached the state it remains in to this day.
And then we know about the numerous resolutions against Israel. We know about the resolutions against North Korea, which are adopted by the Security Council, and even Russia has voted for some of them. About North Korea, then they are violated and no one actually enforces them. As for Israel, not a single resolution has ever been implemented. And so on and so forth, with the exception, it seems, of the creation of the State of Israel. But the creation of a second state for which it seems the USSR once voted, but not a single Arab country supported it. Therefore, of course, international law is very imperfect. It gets adjusted in whatever direction things turn out. The USA is undoubtedly the most powerful country in the world right now, economically, militarily, geopolitically, you name it. And when Trump decided that he could allow himself to do this, he organized such an operation. From the perspective of those spy affairs we've been talking about, this was, of course, a brilliant operation, an absolutely brilliant operation, especially since we can compare it to the operation we also told our viewers about. You can watch our previous broadcasts. We had in the Soviet Union, there was a similar attempt in December 1979 to seize Amin's palace. They did take it, but everyone there was killed and they suffered losses themselves. Of course, it was a victory because they achieved their objective. But the way they achieved it raised a lot of questions. They wanted to capture Amin alive, but in the end, they had to kill everyone. The whole family was wiped out, and they themselves suffered quite heavy losses. After that, by the way, we told you about this as well. In 1984, Yuri Drozdov, together with Andropov, created the Vimpel unit, which was supposed to professionally handle such matters. By the way, it was this very Vimpel unit that, when the situation arose within the Russian Federation, refused to follow orders, to shoot at their own citizens and so on. By the way, it was later transferred from intelligence to, I think now it's under the FSB. It's subordinate to the FSB.
Back then, this group was called something else. If I remember correctly, it was called Zenit. Later, it became Vimpel.
There were operations called Zenit and Cascade. Basically, it was a working name for the waves of Soviet involvement when they would just send army and operational groups as well as special service units. Then later that name didn't stick with the group. Strictly speaking, there wasn't really any group at all. So there was nothing to name, really. The connection with Zenit and Cascade. These were the names given to the operations. And also there was Zenit 1, Cascade 1, 2, 3. There was all sorts of stuff. From an operational standpoint, the operation was carried out almost perfectly. In the sense that only the opponents were killed, that is 32 Cuban guards and a few other people.
So are you talking about Venezuela now? That's what I mean. About
Venezuela, of course, yes, about Maduro. And we understand that the preparations took about 4 months, if not more. That is, the decision most likely was made back in the summer, because this operation wasn't just prepared on the spot. In other words, first of all, the CIA prepared by doing what they did. Again, the same thing Putin tried to do in Ukraine. Do you remember the Fifth Service General Beseda of the FSB? What was it they wanted to do? What did they report to Putin? That they had spent 10 billion hryvnias bribing all of Ukraine and had bought absolutely everyone? Everyone is ready, everyone is bought, everyone will surrender, no one will do anything, no one will defend anything. When Putin started his adventure, it turned out that nothing was working, not the way it was supposed to work. He stated all followed the plan. And when Putin says everything is going according to plan, it means nothing is working out.